Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. First, would love to say a huge thank you to our staff here at Frederick Meyer Gardens for an amazing lunch. Thank you so much. My name is Paul Kiefer. I am the Bank of America Grand Rapids Market President. Many of you may know my predecessor, Renee Tabin. You were expecting a woman with giant red hair here. I do apologize for the quick shift here, but I'm our newly appointed Market President here. It is my honor to lead the 180 associates at Bank of America and Merrill Lynch that represent the Grand Rapids market. When I think about the partnership between Bank of America and World Affairs Council, it fits like a hand in a glove. It's about taking the perspective, the analysis, the research of everything that's happening across the globe and delivering it right here in Grand Rapids, and taking the amazing work that we do here in Grand Rapids and advocating for it across the entire world here. The World Affairs Council of West Michigan was founded by Judge Douglas Hillman and Edgar Orr to connect West Michigan educators, leaders, and citizens with global affairs, guided by the vision of Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a Grand Rapids native and key architect of NATO, the UN, and the Marshall Plan. The annual Award for Excellence in Diplomacy is named in his honor. Additionally, each year, we celebrate the Council's founding by presenting the Hillman Orr Award to individuals who embody this mission. Past honorees include Birgit Close, Ambassador Peter Secchia, Bing Goy, Kendra Kuo and Sonia Johnson, and Dixie Anderson. This year, we pay tribute to two outstanding educators, Dr. Polly Diven of Grand Valley State University and Dr. Mike DeVivo of Grand Rapids Community College. Both professors have introduced the work of the World Affairs Council to so many young adults. They're students who have served as attendees, interns, and volunteers for the Council, helping to inspire a new generation and renew the commitment to global engagement. Dr. Diven is a professor of political science and director of international relations at GVSU. Her research explores how U.S. domestic groups shape foreign policy, and she recently studied female leadership in global affairs. A longtime Council partner, she's played a key role in the Council's award-winning Great Decisions series. In her work with the Council, she developed a college course that has challenged hundreds of students to consider new global perspectives here in our community and served as a model for other local educational partners and for other World Affairs Councils across the nation. Dr. DeVivo is a professor of geography at GRCC, where he built a nationally recognized program. A former Marine and Merchant Marine officer, he has taught over 12,000 students and hosted more than 90 interviews for GRCC's Conversation with a Geographer series. He has delivered lectures around the world, authored a major academic book, and remains deeply engaged in African fieldwork. Mike has also served as the Council's liaison for over a decade, making Council programs a key part of GRCC's geography curriculum. Both professors also hail from academic institutions that have had a long history of supporting the Council. I'll note that GRCC, here at the Council, we have benefited from the talented skills of their Media Technologies Department, of which Klaas Quant is the director. Klaas and his crew have been recording and live streaming Council programming for well over 2 decades now, expanding the impact of this programming, most notably for the Great Decisions series and the Vandenberg Prize. Klaas is here today, taping this program, so let's give him a warm round of applause. Just make sure you get my good side, Clay. Dr. Diven is currently traveling internationally and unable to join us, but she sends her gratitude and warm regards to the community and the Council. I am thrilled, however, to congratulate Dr. Mike DeVivo and our other educational partners who support us in our work of bringing the world to West Michigan. Dr. Mike DeVivo.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, let me join in congratulating both Polly and Mike, and a sincere thanks to the World Affairs Council for 75 years of global programming. Amway was an early corporate sponsor of the World Affairs Council. Our co-founder, Jay Van Andel, was on the board of the council in the 1960s when it achieved legal nonprofit status. And our company understands that West Michigan has an important role to play in the world. Our companies, universities, and many of our civic leaders have engaged significantly with the world. Dating back 75 years, when Grand Rapids native and Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg helped establish the international institutions that endure to this day. Today, in this tradition, we are paying close attention to global issues, and we have the distinct honor of achievements of a gifted American diplomat that we can recognize. It is truly a privilege and honor to present the 2025 Vandenberg Prize to Ambassador Nicholas Burns, former United States Ambassador to China, NATO, and Greece, as well as a significant contributor to many other initiatives that have shaped American foreign policy. Let me get a bit of additional perspective on the background of Ambassador Burns and settle in because it's a distinguished and lengthy career. Ambassador Burns had a long career in American diplomacy, serving 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state. In 2021, Ambassador Burns was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China. He served in that post until January of this year. While serving at the U.S. State Department as a career Foreign Service officer, he was under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, where he led numerous negotiations, including the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal, a long-term military assistance agreement with Israel, and on Iran's nuclear program, which we will certainly discuss in a few moments. As ambassador to NATO in 2001 to 2005, he led U.S. efforts in Brussels on 9/11, when the alliance invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty for the first time in history. He managed the combined State Defense Department U.S. mission when NATO accepted 7 new members in Eastern Europe and embarked on missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was ambassador to Greece and prior to that served as State Department spokesperson. Ambassador Burns worked on the National Security Council at the White House, where he was special assistant to President Clinton and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs, as well as Director for Soviet Affairs for President George H.W. Bush during the collapse of the USSR. Ambassador Burns began his foreign service in the Middle East. He worked at the American Consulate General in Jerusalem, where he coordinated U.S. economic assistance to Palestinians on the West Bank, at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, Egypt, and as an intern at the U.S. Embassy in Mauritania. Ambassador Burns has received 15 honorary degrees, the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, as well as the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. So in the tradition of Arthur Vandenberg, Grand Rapidian and patron saint of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and with the global vision of native son President Gerald R. Ford, we are extremely pleased and honored to present the 2025 Vandenberg Prize to Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Ambassador, please join us up here. Congratulations. Congratulations. We'll give the ambassador a few moments to make some comments, and then we will we're going to have a Q&A session and then open up to the audience. But ambassador, I'll let you make a few comments.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, thank you Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for this warm welcome. I want to say first, what a pleasure it is to be back in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was here under very different circumstances as a guest of Michael and the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan during an epic snowstorm in February of 2019. It was my first visit to your great city, and had the opportunity to have a really extended series of discussions with Sui Zhongkai, who was then the Chinese ambassador to the United States. He's someone I'd known for a long time. We both went to Johns Hopkins for graduate school. And it was at a time of disagreement between the United States and China. I was out of government, but I felt I had to represent our views. And we had a disagreement on multiple issues, but I think it was civil. It was certainly peaceful. It was respectful, and I had a wonderful trip visiting Michael in the World Affairs Council, and I thank Michael for his leadership of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Thank you, sir. I also had the chance, of course, to go to the Ford Museum. I'm old enough to have participated in the elections of as a voter, of 1976 and on, and always respected President Ford, the way he really, I think, raised the spirits of our country after the Watergate scandal, the resignation of President Nixon, the Vietnam War. He was such a man of great ethics and honesty. He was from this great part of the country, and he helped to unite us. I'm also pleased to be here because I'm representing the Cohen Group. I'm vice chairman of the Cohen Group, led by our former Senator Bill Cohen, former Secretary of Defense, and we've had a long, long relationship with Amway Corporation. And we're proud of that, and I've gotten to know Doug DeVos and many other members of the family and the corporation since then, and I wanted to thank Amway for this relationship that we have, but also for everything Amway has done for Grand Rapids. And I had a tour of part of the plant this morning, and I saw the history of the corporation, and so impressed that two young guys, both veterans of the Second World War, your dad and Mr. Van Andel, were able to establish this global corporation that has done so much good in the world. So Doug, thank you for Amway and everything you've done for Western Michigan. And I got to tell you, I was told I was coming to a sculpture garden and a museum, and I couldn't quite visualize it. And we got here, and Michael and I walked around to the botanical garden, the sculpture garden. We didn't quite get to the Japanese garden. That's next time. Saw your beautiful concert venue, and then came inside and saw the exhibits. And Hank, I got to tell you, this is just a beautiful, beautiful, world-class facility. Terribly impressed by it. Want to bring my wife back. She's interested in art. But thank you, Hank, and thanks to the Meyer family for everything you've done for this city and this region. And Hank has written a biography of Senator Vandenberg, and he just gave me a copy as we sat here today, and I want to thank him for that. We had a real good conversation at dinner last night, and again at lunch today. So thank you, Hank. So Michael and I are going to sit down and have a conversation. There's really nothing happening in the world that we need to talk about, right? We can talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is a great crisis, and the Ukrainians have fought so valiantly. We can talk about what I did over the subject that I was working on over the last 4 years, our very difficult relationship with China, contentious relationship with China. We have to talk about what may be happening in the next couple of days. Will the United States enter the war or not as a protagonist, which is a fateful step, dangerous step in Iran, in the war between Iran and Israel. But I want to say a brief word first before we sit down of how honored I am to accept the Vandenberg Prize. It means a lot. It means a lot because Senator Vandenberg meant a lot to the country. And if you read Hank's book, and if you study up on Senator Vandenberg, he made a real journey. Like so many other people in our country, between the two wars, World War I and World War II, he really didn't want America to be out in the world. Certainly not as a leader in the world. Certainly not taking on the great crisis of the 1930s, the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and Italy and Imperial Japan. But when Senator Vandenberg, in this leading position in the Senate, was in the Senate when the Neutrality Act was being voted upon, and then when FDR had to mobilize the entire country, we had 16 million people in uniform to win this war that we had to win. Senator Vandenberg made this ideological progression, not from one party to the next, but in his mind that the United States had to accept its responsibilities. That we had become, certainly since 1940, I guess as of 1942-43, we had surpassed Britain in global power. We were the leading economic power, the leading military power, that the war really was resting on the shoulders of the men and women of this country, our moms and dads, our grandparents, or even great-grandparents if you're a little bit younger than certainly I am. And I always revealed Senator Vandenberg for playing that leading role. He said, of course, everybody knows famously that politics had to stop at the water's edge. But he supported First President Franklin Roosevelt in his waning months, and then especially President Truman, as they decided that we had to win the peace by ensuring that a global war was never fought again. And we have not had a great power war since September 2nd, 1945, in part because of the incredible leadership of Senator Arthur Vandenberg and working with President Truman to bring the Marshall Plan forward so that we could reach out to our allies and support them and create NATO and make sure that the United States was playing a leading role in the world. It was an act of real statesmanship. And this son of Grand Rapids, Michigan, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, has a real place in history. And I'll just tell you that when I was ambassador to NATO on 9/11, boy, you really find out who your friends are when you're hit hard. And we were 6 hours ahead of New York and Washington, two of the cities that were struck, in Brussels, Belgium. And as Michael said, NATO had never invoked Article 5 of the treaty that Senator Vandenberg worked on. And Article 5 meant if one of us is attacked, it shall be considered that all of us are attacked. And of course, what he was thinking about, Vandenberg, what Truman was thinking about was Stalin coming across the North German plain at a time of weakness in Europe in 1948 or 49 or 50 or 51. But because we created NATO, because Vandenberg created NATO with Truman, we were too strong. We deterred that attack. It never came. So when the attack came from an unlikely place, Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, on 9/11, for a couple of hours I sat with my military and diplomatic staff trying to figure out who's going to support us. And the phone rang. And it was one of my colleagues, David Wright, the Canadian ambassador. Boy, are the Canadians great allies of the United States. And he said, let's invoke Article 5. He said, I think the entire alliance will support you. And by the next morning, they had all come together and they supported us. We invoked Article 5. All of those countries, Denmark, Canada, and all the other members of NATO, Germany and Iceland and the United Kingdom, went into Afghanistan and then Iraq with us. They bled with our troops. And I guess maybe the most important lesson I learned in my long diplomatic career over 45 years is it's good to have friends in the world. That despite our awesome power, and we're proud of our military and proud of our country, we shouldn't want to live alone in the world or act alone in the world. That was a lesson I learned in China in trying to build coalitions on human rights or to prevent the Chinese from attacking Taiwan. You need friends in the world. And to me, that's a great legacy of both President Ford, who hails from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Senator Arthur Vandenberg. So I'm humbled by this prize today. Thank you so much.
Well, as you can hear from those comments, the insight that Ambassador Burns brings, to this audience, and we had the pleasure of hosting the ambassador at our headquarters yesterday. We had an employee group that was just riveted to, the discussions that we were having. The feedback we had received after that is that could have gone a couple more hours because there was such a great interest in the insights that the ambassador brings. So I'm going to start with a few questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience after that. But maybe we'll start with, what you focused on is some of the global conflicts, Ambassador, that are happening. We're nearly 3.5 years into the Russia-Ukraine war. In the Middle East, of course, Israel with Hamas, Hezbollah, and now the escalating tensions that we're seeing with Iran and, potential U.S. involvement. And then, of course, the trade war, as many will call it, or, the supply chain dominance, that comes into play as well. So perhaps you can comment on many of those key topics.
Michael, thank you for the softballs. Really appreciate it. One of the things that I mentioned yesterday is that, so I'm a professor of international politics at Harvard.
Yes.
I'm with the Cohen Group, so I think about these issues a lot now that I'm out of the U.S. government. And a couple of years ago, my wife, Libby, made the mistake of coming to one of my talks at Harvard. And we were walking home in Cambridge, Mass. Afterwards, and I said, "How did that go?" And there was a pause. And she said, "You're depressing everybody." And I said, "What do you mean I'm depressing everybody?" She said, "I get that there are 1,000 problems out there." Mm-hmm. Michael just enumerated some of them. But what are you hopeful about? And you can't leave people just with problems. You got to give them hope. So by the end of this session,
we'll get to hope.
We're going to get to hope. So I think this is one of the most critical times that I can remember in my adult lifetime about the challenges we face overseas. Mm-hmm. Because we'll just tick off very quickly. China is rising, and China is filled with self-confidence, and it's an authoritarian communist government, and they don't believe in the values that we believe in about human freedom, about religious freedom, about the freedom of the press, and the rule of law. And this is a real challenge, and my challenge with my team over the last 4 years was, how do you compete with China? They want to overtake us militarily in the Indo-Pacific. We don't want that to happen. They want to be first movers on AI, on quantum computing, on biotechnology. Well, we want to be, our companies, be first movers. We certainly don't want to see the military technologies that spin off enable China to surpass us. They don't trade fairly with the companies of Michigan or across the United States. There's no level playing field if you're involved in China. So this is a big challenge. And so my instructions from President Biden, probably the same instructions that President Trump has given my successor, Senator David Perdue, compete with China. And yet there's another part of it, but don't get us into a conflict. We have to live with the Chinese. It's a nuclear weapons world. It would be catastrophic to end up in a war. So I think of the younger people here, and we're handing the baton of leadership to the younger people here fairly soon, my generation. What a challenge. Stand up to the Chinese, the worst aspects of their policy, and yet try to find a way to engage them on climate change, for instance, where we're the two largest emitters, and don't drive this into a brick wall or a war. That's a big, difficult, generational challenge for the next maybe 2 generations of Americans. And then you go to the Middle East, where we're all focused, I certainly was when we came back from dinner last night, focused on the television set. What choice will President Trump now make? Yeah, I think the Israelis probably had no alternative but to do what they did last week, because the Iranians are going for a nuclear weapons capability. The United Nations came out with a report last week essentially saying, and this is the UN, which almost always papers over differences, saying Iran has lied to the international community for 20 years. They have a secret facility that they didn't even reveal until last week. So if you're Israeli living in that very small sliver of a country on the Mediterranean Sea, and you've got this civilization to your northeast determined to exterminate you, I actually think the Israelis having waited 20 years, and we've been negotiating with the Iranians for 20 years. I was one of those negotiators. They're not willing to negotiate. So Israel's taken the step it has. Question for us now is, should the United States come into the war and use our air power to knock out the most important nuclear enrichment facility, which is a place called Fordow, very deeply embedded in the mountain? That's a big, difficult question, and you got to think about why you would do that. But you also have to think about, well, what are the risks? What are the second-order effects? Could this get us into more trouble than we want to get into? So I'm not trying to come down on either side, but that's how we should all think about it. You can't just think about the benefit, you got to think about the risk. And you know, the Middle East now is an extraordinary time in its development because Israel is far and away the dominant country now in a way that it never was before, because Iran has been weakened significantly, and Hezbollah significantly weakened, Hamas a shadow, mercifully, of its former self. So Israel now has opportunities, but also responsibilities that it hasn't had before. And then finally, on this tour of these three crises, I admire so much the Ukrainian people for standing up to the Russians. And they are the victims, and Putin's the aggressor. And this is really important for the future of Europe, because one of the things that we were able to accomplish, particularly Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, was to take a Europe that had been divided and warlike when you had a communist East and a democratic West throughout the Cold War. And in the words of H.W. Bush, by 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe was finally whole, not divided, free, democratic, and at peace. Putin is threatening all of that. He's trying to divide Europe again. He's trying to take over contiguous states like Ukraine. He's certainly threatening Moldova. I think if he wins in Ukraine, he'll threaten a NATO ally, Estonia or Latvia, then we'll be up with big decisions, warlike decisions of whether to go to war with Russia. The consequences are too important to let him win. So I very much hope that our government in Washington will continue to support the Ukrainians militarily, with intelligence, with political support. At the G7 the other day in Calgary, all the other countries wanted to sanction Russia further, and we are the country that hasn't agreed to do that. And I really hope that President Trump will act in a bipartisan fashion to support the Ukrainians. I think the American people want to do that. I think both parties in Congress probably want to do that as well. So, boy, are these three very confounding, difficult, even perilous issues all happening at the same time for the United States.
We appreciate those perspectives, and obviously very consequential, very sobering, as you say, to see all of these transpiring. Maybe we double-click into the U.S.-China, some of the trade issues, but in your most recent role as U.S. Ambassador to China, you returned in earlier this year.
Yeah.
How would you describe the relationship between the two countries over the last, during your time there, but even prior to that, and where perhaps do you see things headed in the future?
Yeah, and the good thing here is we have a lot of bipartisan consensus on how we should work or not work with the Chinese, how we should confront them, but also try to live in peace. And frankly, that was a great help to me. When I came back to D.C. several times a year, I'd always go to Congress, go to the House, go to the Senate, and I felt, for the most part, the Senate, the Republicans and Democrats saw things in the right way, and that was important to me. I could go to the Chinese and say, we have a united front back in Washington. I think there's no question China is the most important country of the United States. It is now, it will be 20 years from now. We're the two largest economies. We're the two strongest militaries. We're the only two countries that have true global reach, our ability to have an impact on everybody else. And Xi Jinping is a considerable force. He's a one-man ruler. He's done away with Deng Xiaoping's collective rule, which was a very important insight that kind of built modern China and made it stable. He is imbued with this notion, and he says this, that the East is rising and the West is declining. And part of my job was to convince him and convince his leadership that we were not declining, that we have a robust economy built on our private sector success, that our military is second to none, but also that we have great faith in our values. And we're willing to stand up for democracy and human rights. And so it was a real competition. It's the 8th country I had lived in overseas and had represented the United States in, and by far the most contentious. I mean, on a daily basis, it was a pushing match, a slugging match, not literally, but metaphorically. And they were out to push us, and we were out to push back. And I thought by the end of my time in January of this year, I probably spent about 80% of my time on the competitive edge, because that's where we had to be, and maybe 20% on the cooperative edge. We were trying to work in the Biden administration very closely on climate, on global health, on fentanyl, where the Chinese can help us. But I think this competition goes into the next decade and beyond. And so we need to do something important. Compete with the government of China, but consider the people of China not to be adversaries or competitors or, by God, not enemies. And I worry about some of the talk in Washington right now, which is so anti-China. Let's close the doors to Chinese tourists. Well, that's a $30 billion business for the United States. 5.5 million Chinese tourists pre-COVID. You really want to shut the doors. We have 277,000 Chinese students at our universities, at Grand Valley State, at University of Michigan, at Michigan State, every other university in the country. And I'm a college professor. I can't imagine we'd want young Americans to be studying just with other Americans in the 21st century. You need international students to give our students a sense of the world. And certainly Chinese students. What happens to Chinese students in our classrooms? It's the first time they can really research any subject on Google, because there's no Google in China. There's a firewall. They can understand what happened in their country in Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989. They can see that their government is a human rights abuser in Xinjiang province against the Uyghur population. And you see that they are living for the first time in a free, open, democratic society. A lot of these young people want to stay in our country. A lot of our tech firms want to hire those young people and then give them a H-1B visa. And suddenly they got a green card, and then they end up creating some of our most important tech companies. If you think about the Boston biotech community and then Silicon Valley, an inordinate number, or a big number, of the founders of these companies are Indian Americans and Chinese Americans who then become citizens of our immigrant-based society. So I think it'd be a great mistake to revoke Chinese visas, or to say to international students, you can't have, we're not going to give you visas, or to say to Harvard, where I teach, well, you can't even have any international students. And I'm not trying to be political here at all. I'm just trying to think what's best for us. Open door. You know, our country, young people come here and they love this country because they often have advantages here that they don't have, especially in a place like China, in their own country. So I think there's a lot at stake for us to make, compete with the government. That was my job, definitely. Chinese people, not our enemy. So let's engage them.
Well said. And, as we think about trade, so last month, certainly on Liberation Day, there was, escalating trade challenges. And I'll focus on China again here, just from a supply chain perspective, because I think it impacts many of the companies, across the U.S. and certainly here in West Michigan. There was an agreement to reduce those tariffs, temporary pause on the reciprocal, but what do you see as the time frame, and where do you see that headed from a trade standpoint?
Here, let me say, I support what President Trump is doing with the Chinese. China's been the major disruptor of global trade for 30 years. If you think about intellectual property rights violations, forced technology transfer, kicking American companies out of the marketplace, using the cyber power of the Chinese state to go after individual American companies. It's an extraordinary thing. I mentioned to Doug yesterday, I tried to meet every American CEO who came through China, because that's a big part of my job. And a lot of them have been successful, but the stories they could tell. about the challenges that the Chinese state put up against them were really forbidding. So I think President Trump is right to say we need to be tough-minded here. And, apart from the 145% tariffs, which I don't think anybody felt was the answer, we have put, President Biden implemented all of President Trump's tariffs from President Trump's first term. President Trump is now implementing all of President Biden's tariffs. President Biden put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and 50% on Chinese semiconductors and 25% on lithium batteries. So you have two American presidents who've really seen eye to eye on this. And the goal is to say to the Chinese, look, we've got a weapon. It's called tariffs. You have the same weapon. We have a big economic relationship. Let's preserve it. But you Chinese have to, Chinese government, give American businesses a fair chance to succeed. And so this is kind of like this is a showdown at the OK Corral. And I think it's going to win into the autumn.
Okay.
This is too hard to work out right now, too complex. But I do think at the end, Michael, we talked about this yesterday,
right,
that the self-interest of both countries and logic will prevail. There'll be a trade deal. Mm-hmm. China needs it, and the United States economy needs it too. And this is a big trade. It's our third largest trade partner.
Yes.
So there's going to be a lot of emotion and a lot of fireworks. But I would say by September, October, there'll be a trade deal.
Okay, very helpful. And you mentioned NATO earlier, and with Senator Vandenberg, obviously it was 1948, if I've got my dates right. There was a resolution for the development of a regional defense alliance, which then emerged into to NATO. In today's security environment, Ambassador, how seriously would you take the administration's threats to pull out of NATO? Where do you see that headed? That's a key question, I think, for many.
Well, the NATO summit is next week in the Netherlands, in The Hague. And I don't think there's a serious threat now. That was more President Trump in his first term, years ago. I think he's been saying consistently, but Secretary Rubio has been saying, we're in NATO for good. And I know a lot of people have been critical of President Trump, so let me say something else I think he's done well. He challenged the European allies to do what I tried to challenge them to do when I was ambassador 20 years ago: spend more on your defense. Mm-hmm. We are spending, the American people, 3.7% of our GDP every year on our national defense. And I certainly saw when I was ambassador to NATO, we were holding up the NATO alliance as we went into Afghanistan, Iraq. And so President Trump came along and said, in his first term, you got to spend 3% of GDP. Guess what they're going to announce next week? He has now pushed them further. Every NATO country is going to commit to spend at least 5% of its GDP on defense, 3.5% straight defense spending, 1.5% related infrastructure to support our militaries that operate together. I know a lot of people have been critical of him, but he's got the job done. Mm-hmm. And he was able to push the allies in a way, and I think President Trump will go there next week, and he'll be supportive of NATO. Mm-hmm. Because NATO has responded to his biggest issue and our biggest issue, which is we've got global responsibilities. We have troops in Korea, in Japan. We're facing the Chinese. We may be facing the Iranians, who knows, in the next day or two. And so we do need more support from the European allies, and I think by next week we will have that commitment. That'll be a really important day. So let's give the current administration the credit it deserves for that.
Excellent. And let me go back to, I think the topic of the day in terms of, Israel and Iran, and then the U.S., potential engagement into that, and in some of the, even yesterday as we were speaking, there was kind of breaking news, words like we and our being used, that, we're now part of this conflict. Where do you see that emerging? And obviously there are big decisions for the administration and President Trump to make.
This is about we were talking yesterday, this is about the hardest issue that any president can face. I would take out the yellow legal pad and draw a line down the middle. Okay, what are the reasons why we might do this, and what are the reasons why we should be cautious about maybe not doing it? And I think in the first column, if you think about Iran, messianic state, very aggressive, killed a lot of Americans the last 40 years, by the way. 266 Marines killed in the bombing of our Marine barracks in Beirut in '83. I remember that. Bombing of our embassy, bombing of Hobart Towers, a military dormitory in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. I arrived about 5 hours after that attack. I just happened to be with our Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, in the Middle East, and saw what the Iranians did. And this is a country that if it gets a nuclear weapon, is going to terrorize the smaller states of the Middle East. And it's been the position of every Democratic and Republican president for 25 years. We can't afford this to happen. So what's the key factor? The Israelis have bombed Natanz last week, one of the enrichment facilities. There's a facility called Fordow, deeply embedded in the mountains, that only the United States, with our air power, will be able to penetrate and bomb and knock out. And so if we could do that, if the president was convinced by his team, they met yesterday in the Situation Room, we know that there's a very high probability that this mission would succeed, and therefore we would knock out their nuclear enrichment program, and they wouldn't be a threat anymore, then I think the reasons for doing it are compelling, frankly. Here's the downside, potentially. What if we strike and yet we miss, or the weapon doesn't do what we think it's going to do, and they're left with a nuclear facility that's intact, and it's like you taken a baseball bat to a hornet's nest, and they're mad as hell, and they've got all sorts of ways that they can hit back against us, no matter what we do. They can target American business people, individuals in the United States. They can target our troops. They can try to kill Americans, a continent away. This could be a real fight. And we all learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, once you make the decision to go to war, you control that decision, the day, the time. But you don't control anything afterwards. And you never know how that war is going to end and on whose terms. And boy, we have some bitter lessons I think our veterans feel we have a lot of bitter lessons from that. So I guess it all hinges on the intelligence. Is there a high probability of success? I would then recommend yes. But if that's not the case, and that long list of negatives is always there, I think it probably leads you in the other direction. So this is why we elect people to make these big decisions for us. And I really hope and pray that President Trump will make the best decision and that we will be successful in whatever we do.
Yep. And certainly the significance, the gravity of the situation is very clear. Maybe one more question I'll have, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And I'll go back to China. Two superpowers, and you talked about technology, militarily, economically. Where do you see opportunities again to cooperate, and where do you see we're going to need to continue to be very, very forceful?
Yeah. There are some people in our political system, mainly in the extremes of it, saying, let's just shut down the relationship commercially with China. Let's not have any students or tourists. We're going to have to fight. In the nuclear weapons age, I think that is almost insane to think like that. I mean, we have to have a healthy respect for the power of the United States and China. And if we ever clashed, and if it devolved into exchange of nuclear weapons, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who would die, either immediately from the blast or the fallout. We're talking about civilizations being destroyed, about parts of our countries that would be uninhabitable for decades, if not centuries, given the fallout. And so, one of the reasons I think why we haven't had a great power war since the Second World War, since Vandenberg's time, is because we had atomic power as of 1945 in the desert in New Mexico, and we've had hydrogen power since the 50s. And it's tempered every Soviet, Chinese, and American leader since, and Russian leader since. So I think we've got to do two things. Compete, but we have to live with China. And we have to keep the door open to its people. And I think on the margins, we're the two largest emitters of carbon. I'm concerned about climate change. The science is real. We got to work with China. They're the largest contributor of carbon. 31% of all the emissions are Chinese. Fentanyl, leading cause of death in our society, 18 to 49 years of age, is fentanyl overdose. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've had this problem in Grand Rapids, in Western Michigan. We sure have where I live. And the majority of the precursor chemicals that make up the synthetic opioid come from Chinese black market firms to the drug cartels in Mexico. This is not Chinese state, but these are the bad guys in China. And President Biden and President Xi agreed that we would work together. We did that over the last year of the Biden administration. The Chinese shut down online platforms. They arrested 300 people. There's an area where I think that President Trump can now work with the Chinese on fentanyl. So I don't think we should think in old Cold War terms about China. In the old Cold War, we still have some people old enough to remember the old Cold War. I'm one of them. We were physically separate. Nobody in my generation went to Moscow or Leningrad or to study. But now our young people are together, and so we need to make a distinction between the government versus the people and try to keep the peace.
And I think that distinction is so critically important, as we spoke yesterday, and your focus on people and the connection of the people of the U.S. and the people of China interacting. And again, I have the benefit of traveling there, and when you're meeting with people, that it's just that human nature of wanting to do what's best. So, thank you for those insights. Let's open it up to the audience. I know we have microphones, I think, around the room. So for those that would like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
This one right here.
Yeah, I have a question. I'll try to speak loudly. You used the phrase going to war, and you suggested the president had the responsibility here. I think it's accurate to say that not since Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war in World War II have we actually gone to Congress on this question of going to war. Is this a part of the Constitution that's no longer relevant today, or does it have relevance?
It's a highly pertinent question this afternoon. We were just talking about it at lunch before we came up here. There's no question the Constitution gives Congress the right to declare war. It's absolutely 100% clear. But in the last 70 or 80 years, respective Congresses have kind of given that constitutional right to the executive. And we've seen this awesome rise in the power of our presidency in both parties. And I know that there are two members of Congress, Congressman Massey, who's a conservative Republican from Kentucky, and Congressman Rohana, a progressive Democrat from Silicon Valley. They came together yesterday with a bill, let's have Congress decide this. Senator Tim Kaine made a speech on the floor yesterday saying the same thing. These are very lonely voices. The leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties is not coming forward, at least as of this morning, to say, we should make this decision. Mm-hmm. And I think in the age we live in of terrorism, of nuclear weapons, of these bitter regional wars, Congress has really given every president since really Truman the right to declare war, both parties. So you're right on the merits of it, what the Constitution says, but the politics, I think, is quite different now.
Great question, thank you. Gentleman here.
Welcome to Michigan.
Thank you.
I'm Dennis Flesland, the Honorary Consul of Norway here in Michigan. And I want to turn your attention to another part of the world that hasn't blown up yet. That's the high north, with climate change and all those changes in terms of resources, transportation, security. The high north is becoming a new focus. Do you have any views on that?
The Consul General and I had a chance to talk before the lunch, and I thank him for representing our great ally, Norway. Boy, NATO is interesting because you have big countries like the US or the UK or France, Germany. Norway is, 5 million people? Pound for pound, one of our very best allies in the world. So thanks to Norway. I know you're representing them here in Michigan. The Arctic is a battleground now. And because of the warming seas, and because there really is a prospect now of a routine summer transit between the Asia-Pacific and the Atlantic through the Arctic Sea because of the melting of the polar ice cap and climate conditions, It's going to revolutionize trade. It's going to make trade much speedier between the two continents. And the Russians want to dominate the Arctic. We have an institution called the Arctic Council. Russia's on it, Canada's on it, the United States is on it, Denmark is on it, Norway's on it, Sweden's on it, Finland. And the Russians are trying to dominate the Chinese. And if you look at the map, we have a lot of geographers here and professors of geography. Professor, would you call China an Arctic country? The Chinese say, we are a near Arctic country. We want to get on that Arctic Council. And now a generation of American diplomats have been fighting to keep China off the Arctic Council because we democratic countries, all NATO, by the way, feel that we can kind of balance Russia. But if China comes in, because they're so avaricious for minerals and trade and all that, we'll have a big problem. So the Arctic has become a big arena of superpower competition. And God bless the Canadians. What great allies the Canadians are. And, you know, we don't have many... The Canadians and the Finns have the icebreakers. We have one broken down icebreaker, the United States of America. And we're an Arctic power. Look at Alaska. And so we're continually borrowing icebreakers. And you need icebreakers for military and commercial purposes from the Finns and from the Canadians. So we need to up our game, I think, we Americans on the Arctic Council. Thank you, Consul General.
I'll dive in here a second. I'll take us back to the Middle East and ask about Saudi Arabia. And we're talking about Iran right now, Iran and Israel, but before October 7, the Saudis and the Israelis looked like they were close to agreements and things of that nature, but the Saudis have been kind of quiet in this, in all that's been happening here. How do you see their role in the Middle East, despite whatever happens between Israel and Iran?
Thanks, Doug. And you know, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris are now real regional powers, given their oil and energy power. And you saw that President Trump, first term, President Trump's second term, where'd he go on his first trip? He didn't go to Japan, he didn't go to Germany or Britain, he went to the Middle East, to those three countries in particular. So they're substantial countries. They're also interesting because they have, the three governments want to make major investments in technology because I think they understand that technology has really taken center stage in the global power balance. And so you see that as a result of President Trump's trip, the Saudis and Emiratis and Qataris are making major investments in USAI firms. And that helps us because our firms, our companies, are in direct competition with Chinese companies as to who's going to be number one. The irony of the situation, Doug, is if you and I had had this conversation 5 or 10 years ago, we would have said, well, the Saudis hate the Iranians. And the Iranians, this is a Shia-Sunni thing. And the Iranians hate the Saudis. The Saudis have spoken out against what the Israelis have done over the last 6 days. The Emiratis have, the Qataris have. They don't want a war in their region. I don't think that their people would allow them to be cheerleaders, despite the fact that they're authoritarian regimes, for the Israelis. But your point is a good one. Because of the Abraham Accords that President Trump negotiated between Israel and the UAE, those three countries, and I think the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Omanis, all want to normalize their relationship with Israel. And yet they're holding back. And it's not because of Iran, it's because of the Palestinians. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has said as recently as last week, we will not normalize with Israel until Israel recognizes the right of Palestinians to have a state, their own state that's real, and a capital in East Jerusalem. So that's what they're holding out for. And I know there was President Biden's fervent belief in his last year of office that he could negotiate that. What happened? October 7th, 2023 happened. It was the Hamas attack on Israel and the unraveling of the Middle East and these incredible changes we've seen with Syria gone, the Syrian dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, Hezbollah and Hamas significantly weakened, Israel significantly strengthened, and now Iran significantly weakened. Boy, the history of the last almost 2 years, not quite 2 years, has turned the Middle East upside down. all the things that we knew to be true over the last 40 years are no longer true. So can the Israelis, let's just posit hypothetically that Israel defeats the Iranians and there's a ceasefire and we or the Israelis knock out the Iranian nuclear weapons development program. Will the Israelis then be able to summon the statesmanship as the victor to say, we want a general peace? Will they make their peace with the Palestinians? Now that's going to be hard because there's no Palestinian entity right now that I think anybody would trust to run a government. But could you make a commitment? Could the Israelis eventually make a commitment to eventually recognize and help the Palestinians? Because without that, I think the politics of the street in the Arab world will prevent these Arab governments from normalizing with the Israelis until the Palestinian issue, which has bedeviled the entire Middle East now for 77 years, will that be resolved finally? I think that's still the key question, Doug.
We have maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, we have one over here.
Thank you.
Here. Sorry.
Good to see you, Ambassador, Consul General for Canada here in Michigan. And can I say, God bless America?
Absolutely.
Thank you for your words. This week we're hosting the G7 up in Canada. The conversation, I think, between our two countries with this administration and with the last administration have, I think, increasingly been moving from strictly bilateral issues to more geostrategic conversations. Where do you see, just in a process perspective, the structures that we have used to bring order to the world over the last 80 years, where are they evolving? Is it the G7? Is it the G20? How do we organize ourselves going forward?
Thank you very much. And, I think that's such an interesting and important question that you asked that I think we're debating it. I'm sure you're debating it in Grand Valley State and in Ann Arbor, in East Lansing, and certainly we are up in Massachusetts. On the one hand, I think it makes sense for the democracies to stay together because we're being challenged by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So the fact that NATO exists, it's so important that we recommit to NATO next week, that we have our 5 allies in East Asia, Thailand, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. We have a strategic partnership with India. The democratic countries need to stick together to balance the authoritarian countries. The G7 makes sense because they are among the largest economies in the world. What we don't have is we don't have the vision of the institution that Eleanor Roosevelt, and Arthur Vandenberg had. Hank and I were just looking at a photo of Vandenberg at one of the first meetings of the United Nations. In 1946, he went with Eleanor Roosevelt. And the UN has succeeded in being a champion of human rights, on development, but it has not succeeded in being a place where the great powers of the world can work out their differences. That was the Roosevelt's vision and Vandenberg's vision 80 years ago. So I think we need to reform these institutions so that they look more like 2025 than 1945. Who has power in the Security Council? The 5 victors of the Second World War. And they're all nuclear weapons powers. And so how about Nigeria? 1 in 4 people in the world, 2 generations from now, will be Africans. There's got to be room for Africa and probably for Nigeria or South Africa on the Security Council. How about Brazil? How about India? How about Japan? They've been excluded for 80 years. And you can't take a template of power from 80 years ago and think it's going to succeed in our century. So I think that's one big struggle ahead, and it's been stymied in the last 4 or 5 years by our disagreements with Putin and our disagreements with Xi Jinping. So the Security Council is frozen. It can't do a thing. It couldn't even agree that today is Wednesday, June 18th. They'd have a big debate about that. So I think that's ahead of us. And again, we need a far-sighted American president who's willing to give up a little bit of American influence in the Security Council over the long term to say, yeah, well, of course we need an African country. Of course we need a South American country. Of course we need India. on the Security Council. So reform of these institutions, unless we're going to abolish them and start all over again, which is going to be pretty difficult to do, I think that's something for the younger people in this audience to think, how can I contribute to that? How can your generation do better than our generation did on this very big issue? Thank you. It's a good question.
One final question, very quickly.
Thank you, Ambassador. For those of us who are going to be working with these young people in just a few weeks, I'm interested in framing something, and I'm not going to have you in my classroom to do this in a few weeks, so I'm going to do it right now. You describe the success of the NATO allies increasing their defense spending under President Trump, which is, it's documented, that's happened. That could be framed as bullnose diplomacy, kind of, winning the day. It could also be framed as those European allies seeking to become more independent because of fears of a lack of American presence in NATO, or perhaps a repositioning of our allyship with Russia and with President Trump's support for Vladimir Putin. That's a conversation I'm going to be having in the classroom in the next few weeks, and going to be having again this fall. And so in a world in which we do need friends, how would you estimate that change in relationship? Is this Europe standing up for itself and still being a strong partner with America? Is there a gap in that North Atlantic relationship that is problematic for my students to really consider? And is it worth potentially damaging those friendships to see an increase in defense spending when America does reap some benefits from being kind of the monopower in terms of military in the West?
Professor, thank you. And I enjoyed meeting you before lunch started, and good luck with your class. I'll be having the same conversation with my class as well. Vandenberg, he held a view for most of his life that America could kind of stay away from the rest of the world. And then he became convinced by the facts of a world war that we couldn't. And that particularly in rebuilding from that war, we had to dive into leadership. I actually think that's what's before us now. I'm alarmed by the degree of isolationism and even unilateralism as well on the part of many members of our Congress, both parties, by the way, kind of far left, far right, if you look at the political spectrum. And I said before that I think probably if I reflect on my own experience in government, maybe the lesson I learned most frequently and most importantly was be nice to your allies, because you need them. We need them. And I told you about 9/11 and the Canadians coming to our rescue. And I think as we move forward, we've got to be firmly attached to those allies. This is a troubled world. And if anything, if you look at power, where it's going, China and Russia are claiming more of the power. Economic power, tech power, military power. North Korea's with them. They're fighting in Ukraine with the Russians. The Iranians are allied with them as well. And so you got to have friends in the world, and you have to lean on your friends. And I fear that right now, what my hope for President Trump would be that he would make this conversion that Vandenberg made, to say, yes, America needs to sometimes act on its own, but most of the time has to act with others. And I think that's a terribly important lesson for us. He learned it 80 years ago. I think we need to relearn it now. And I'll end just maybe with Michael's forbearance, a story I told Michael and his team yesterday that'll just illustrate this, I hope. On 9/11, when we went to vote for Article 5, it was the morning of September 12th, and I was the American ambassador, and I just suddenly thought to myself, I probably shouldn't do this on my own. So I need the President George W. Bush to authorize me, because we knew this was a declaration of war against al-Qaeda. So I called my friend and mentor, Condoleezza Rice. She was in the Situation Room at 4 a.m. She had had no sleep. She was working the crisis. And I said, Condi, the Allies want to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I said, thank you, Condi, and I think I need President Bush's authorization to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. And I tried a third time. I said, but Condi, and she cut me off. She said, Nick, he's had a really bad day. It's 4 in the morning. Go for it. I said, I'll take that as my presidential instruction. I'm going to run down to Room 1, the NATO headquarters, and I'm going to vote for Article 5. She said, before you do that, one more thing. I said, what's that? And she said, it's good to have friends in the world. Boy, have I thought about that recently. As we think about the crises that Michael posed in his first question. What do we do about China? What do we do about the Middle East in flames? How do we stop Putin? Because we have friends that we can rely on. And they're democratic friends. And they believe the same things we do. And they're culturally different. And sometimes you need to push them, as President Trump has pushed them on defense spending. Sometimes they push us, like do more on climate change. It's a pretty good relationship. So I hope that the United States is going to stay firmly attached to our NATO allies and our Asia allies and grow those alliances, expand them as new countries come into play. Because without it, how do we face this 21st century alone? Why would we want to do that? So I hope this is a hopeful message in the end. I got my wife talking to me now. Don't depress me.
Well, Ambassador, I think you'd all agree with me that we could spend the rest of the afternoon hearing the insights and perspectives. But let me just close with our sincere gratitude for your visit, but also for your decades of service. I mean, this award is, just one to recognize the amazing service that you've had and your diplomacy and leadership. So we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. I'm Michael Vandenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Special thanks and congratulations to Ambassador Burns. We really appreciate it. We were all captivated today, and these are the diplomats. These are the global engagers that represent us, and we should support them in every single way that we can. Thank you, too, to Michael and to Amway for being such important partners, to Paul and Bank of America for helping us so deeply with this event and all of our endeavors at the World Affairs Council. Thank you to all of you for wanting to be globally engaged. That was Senator Vandenberg's legacy. He wanted us to be this way. And here we are, 76 years later, still meeting and talking about these important issues. If you're not one of our corporate sponsors or educational partners, I encourage you to join us in this effort to be globally astute and internationally engaged. You can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. And please take one of these beautiful, beautiful, creative, constructed items home with you from our friend Abigail, who worked so hard on them personally. If you open it, there's a wealth of global information in there. So a very creative way to get you engaged in the world. Thank you, Abigail, for making these. And I close with the words of our first Vandenberg Prize recipient, Ambassador Jon Huntsman Jr., ambassador to both Russia and China. And he said to us all those years ago, kudos to all of you who are here today to keep this organization going. And remember the slogan, to change the world, you first have to know the world. It's a big deal. Thank you for all thinking it's a big deal. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for being with us today.